in March 2013, a friend of mine, Jasper, suggested that I read this book by a man called Archie Hamilton. And Hamilton was a New Zealand engineer who was working for the British. And this started in 1928 when the British had a mandate over Iraq after the end of the First World War and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And Hamilton was an engineer, and he got sent out to build this road. And it was a really key link from Erbil, the capital of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, to the Iranian border. And it was a tiny, tiny chunk. It was 180 kilometers long. It was a small chunk of the main road from Damascus to Tehran. And it was a very, very important link because the Zagros Mountains that go between the Caspian Sea all the way down to the Persian Gulf were at that time completely impassable to wheeled vehicles. They'd never ever been crossed by any wheeled vehicle. So if you wanted to go from London to Tehran, for instance, by car and train and ferry, you'd get to Iraq, and then you'd have to go all the way down the whole length of Iraq, down to Basra, around the bottom of the mountains, and then all the way back up through Iran to Tehran. So this road was really important. But what inspired me was Hamilton's story. He wrote this book, Road Through Kurdistan, and it's a wonderful story of leadership about this guy who was sent out completely by himself, and he had to go to the area, he had to survey the route. Once he worked out what the route was going to be, all he had was one assistant from Baghdad, and that was it, someone who could help him translate. He then had to go to the tribal leaders along the route and speak to them and get them on board so that he could then to get permission to build the road through their land, and also to get permission to recruit villagers for the workforce. And 4 years later, when he'd finished this road, he was employing over 1,000 people a day, and he was the only Westerner who was involved in the project on the ground, on the front line, as it were. He had to do everything from, as I've said, planning and surveying the route, training everyone from the laborers to the people that were helping him with the complex surveying equipment. He was the doctor. He did everything. But the really interesting bit about this whole wonderful story was the tribal chieftains. There's one area on the road as you approach Rwandus, or as you go from Harir to Rwandus, you cross this pass called the Spillik Pass. And it was a really steep pass, but it was the only point on the whole of this mountain ridge that a road could go over. And for a long time, the tribe that lived there was the Serchi tribe. And for a long time, the men of the Serchi tribe had been, let's just say they'd been waylaying people that crossed that road. Occasionally, according to Hamilton, this is, they would often relieve travelers of some of their possessions in order to make it easier for them to carry on. And these people were classed by the British government at the time as bandits and robbers and highwaymen and people that were impossible to work with. So Hamilton was building his road, and he was riding along on his donkey, and this old man came at the head of a group of villagers, and they were going up this steep, winding pass, and Hamilton swore at the man. I don't think Hamilton swore. Sorry. Hamilton went to the man and asked him to get out of the way and didn't really show him any respect. And the villagers turned around and said that man was Hamid Akin, who was the legendary head of Kalakin, which is the next door village. And realizing what he'd done and the horrible mistake that he'd made, Hamilton chased after Kalakin and made friends with him. Apologized and eventually made friends with him after he disrespected the man so much. It was it's a little tiny story, but it's a wonderful example of how he came in and had a huge impact on the area. And this road is so important now still, because it's the only route to cross the mountains for a long way in any direction. And when it was built, it allowed trade to go through. It opened up the area to the outside, and it also allowed, or from the British point of view anyway, it allowed soldiers in and the rule of law into the area for the first time ever, which made a huge difference. But the building itself, this road was, everything was done by hand, although eventually by everything was done by hand, and then eventually he had a few pneumatic compressors to help drill holes that would be bored deep into the side of the hills and then packed full of dynamite. And in the Rwanda's gorge, it's this huge gorge with almost vertical sides, and he had this road that was weaving in the bottom, literally in a sheer cliff face. So the road is cut out like a half tunnel in the side of the cliff, and he had to bring down a lot of rock above it in order to do this. So these men would be effectively abseiling down. They'd blast a tiny ledge, and then these men would be abseiling down and would sit there with pneumatic drills, hammering holes deep, 30 feet deep into the mountain, which would then be packed full of dynamite. And there was one man who got paid extra for this part of his job, and he was always the quickest person. And he would run along with a flaming torch, and he would light the ends of all the fuses as he went along the whole section of cliff face that had been prepared that day. And the fuses were long, but they weren't too long. So the first sticks of dynamite had gone off before he reached the end. So no one ever knew if the man had survived until he rushed out of this white dust cloud at the end of the day. It was a different time. You wouldn't have that happening now. But the Hamilton Road was special for me because of the relationship that Hamilton had with the area. By the end, he could speak Kurdish, and he was known for the care that he took over his workforce and how valuable each person was to him as a human being. And still, in Kurdistan, the road is known as the Hamilton Road. And I walked along the road in 2013 with a friend, Jasper, dressed in Kurdish clothing, and we carried a camera with us to interview people, and we met a lot of not Hamilton's friends, because this was in 1928, but we met a lot of people whose fathers and grandfathers had worked directly for Hamilton, and everyone had wonderful, wonderful things to say about him. He was an interesting guy. I would have loved to have met him.